Listen to her first question to JFK. Can you give any reason why a contented bachelor would want to get married? That's insightful. It's like a leading question, isn't it? Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jessica Nell, and if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription. I don't take it lightly that we spend time together in this way. And so if you have come across this video and this is your first video of mine, I just want you to know that I value your time and I value your subscription, and I would actually love to earn it. So if you like this video, like it. If you want to subscribe, subscribe. We are going through The Kennedy Men, 3 Generations of Sex, Scandal, and Secrets by Nellie Bly. That is a pen name, but she is a New York Times bestselling author. Right now, my plan is to have The Kennedy Men books and discussions on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of each week until we get through it. So those are the days that you can look for these books. We will do other things in the time period that leads to and goes over the weekends. So that is our schedule for this book, just moving forward. Today we're starting out with chapter 7. Jack aims for vice president and takes a bride. Joseph P. Kennedy in 1953 had asked a valid question. He said, "How long do you have to live in this country before you become an American? We've been here for 2 generations. Isn't that enough?" Because people were still calling them Irish Catholic or Irish American. And he thought, aren't we just Americans at this point? Joseph Kennedy's advice to Lem Billings in 1957 was the following: "From here on, you must think of Jack less as a friend and more as a potential candidate for the presidency of the United States." Now, interestingly, in this book, she has not come outright and said it, but there's a lot of implications around the relationship with Lem Billings. He was thought of, and I think self-described as, a homosexual. And there's a whole book that's been written about Jack and Lem. She does not actually get into the details, even though this is 3 Generations of Sex, Scandal, and Secrets. She does not touch it, but she does keep hinting at it. And so as I'm reading through, I want to alert you that if that's something you're curious about, you could go dig. There is an entire book devoted to them. We do know that they went on this great European travel tour during one of their summers at Harvard. And Lem Billings was one of his closest friends and advisors. So this advice is interesting, that you need to think of Jack less as a friend and more as a potential candidate for the presidency of the United States. Joseph is doing the around the edges work to cultivate Jack's presidency, not just in Jack, but in the way that the people around him relate to him. Here's how the chapter starts. Jacqueline Lee Bouvier was the daughter of a socially ambitious mother and an incorrigible rake with impeccable social credentials. Black Jack Bouvier, that was his nickname, was 16 years older than his bride when they wed in East Hampton in 1928, and he was unfaithful to her on their honeymoon cruise. You can't get much lower than that. Making a vow to a woman. I mean, there's some pretty horrible behavior in here, but we haven't heard somebody doing this yet. That's like wicked. To take a vow, to make a promise before God, before everyone you know, and then to break it within the week. It's shocking behavior. He had the social connections, however, that Janet yearned for. Their daughter, Jacqueline Lee, was born the following July, 1929, just months before the stock market crash that would change their world forever. After several separations and the birth of a second daughter, Caroline Lee, who was known simply as Lee, Janet and Black Jack divorced in 1940. So that would have been when Jackie was about 10 or 11 years old. 2 years later, Janet married Hugh Dudley Auchincloss, a wealthy stockbroker. His nickname was Hughie. He came with a Park Avenue apartment and 2 waterfront estates. Although nowhere near the libertine that Black Jack Bouvier was, Hughie had one indulgence. He was an obsessive collector of pornography in all forms, with one of the largest collections in the world. So this is Jackie's stepfather that comes into her life literally at the start of her teen years. Very interesting. One of the observations that's been made about teen girls at present with social media is the ways that they have changed as a group in how they relate to sexuality in some really significant ways that a lot of researchers believe is a response to the heightening of pornography in our society. To have a connection with pornography in any form, or at least an understanding of it and a fear of what it could mean at that critical time when you're coming of age, affects young girls. And I just can't see how, surely at some point in her teen years, Jackie would have come aware of this. And for this to all happen at the very start of your own puberty and reproductive life, I think would be pretty formative for how you view the desires of men and the relation of women to those desires. Now, we're not given any indication that she, stumbled on his collection or was personally introduced to it or anything like that. I am making some assumptions there. But I do think that if your stepfather is the largest holder of any collection in the world, that certainly you would have some familiarity with it. If he was the largest collector of teapots, then you would see them around your house, So I don't think it's too far of a leap. But y'all can let me know in the comments what you think about that. Well, Black Jack, her biological father, sank into alcoholic self-indulgence. And though there were many women in his life, he never married again. Jackie was educated at the exclusive Miss Porter's school. In her graduation entry in the yearbook, she said her ambition was, quote, not to be a housewife, end quote. In 1947, she was named Queen Deb of the Year, and she made the dean's list at Vassar College. She won a Vogue writing contest for an essay, and she went on to earn a degree in French literature from George Washington University. After graduation, she took a $42.50 a week job as the inquiring camera girl of the Washington Times-Herald. She met the rising young Massachusetts senator, that would be JFK, at a Georgetown dinner party and asked to interview him. Asking the question, listen to her first question to JFK. Can you give any reason why a contented bachelor would want to get married? That's insightful. It's like a leading question, isn't it? Although Jackie and Jack had been dating since June 1951, both saw others. And by the summer of 1952, Jack was too immersed in his first Senate campaign to get involved. Only after the election, after he escorted Jackie to Dwight Eisenhower's inaugural ball and invited her to the opening session of the 83rd Congress, did things get serious. I mean, once you're going to inaugural balls with this girl and you're a public figure, as well as inviting her to Congress, that's heating up. That's taking the relationship public in a way that he did not normally do. Jack, who had once told a newspaper interviewer that he wanted a wife who was something nice, intelligent, but not too brainy, was smitten. One of the first insiders to realize that the relationship between the senator and the debutante was serious was Jack's secretary, Evelyn Lincoln. Her job had always included juggling the many women he was seeing and to call them for him. Jackie stood out because she wasn't on Lincoln's telephone list. When he didn't ask me to call Jackie, I knew that she had to be someone special, Lincoln recalled. One day he came in and said, I'm going to have an engagement party on June 25th. I said, who? It's interesting that she didn't know for sure. And he said, Jacqueline Bouvier. Yet around that time, Jackie confided to her cousin, John Davis, that Jack was so vain, quote, he goes to a hairdresser almost every day to have his hair done, so it'll always look bushy and fluffy. His hair did look bushy and fluffy. I mean, when we look at those photos of him, it's like, one of the things that stands out about him is his very nice hair. He's got quite a coif. If you look at it compared to his two brothers, it does have a little extra bushiness and fluff. So maybe it paid off. Maybe his effort was valid. As for Jack, her cousin, John Davis, writes, if he had not come from such a social climbing family and did not have such powerful political ambitions, he would probably have never got married at all. That makes sense. We were told that he turned to men for his emotional and intellectual stimulation, and he had a string of girls. So, in old England, maybe he would have just been a wealthy bachelor who threw the parties he liked and entertained as he liked and went about life, but he wanted to be the president, so he needed a wife. On the whole, the cousin found Jackie's attitude so blasé that he was surprised to learn the following spring that they had become engaged. I think Jackie knew what she was getting into. Maybe not entirely. I think she didn't know how it would feel to be publicly humiliated by your husband's mistresses, but I think she knew mistresses were part of the package. Almost immediately, problems emerged. The young couple was rarely alone. Jackie discovered her fiancé's preference for the company of men. Here are some of those implications I was talking about Lem Billings. Jack Kennedy, the cousin recalled, was terribly fond of his male friends and his family. He had this damnable tendency to always have people around. On May 23rd, following a 7-year courtship, Eunice Kennedy married Sergeant Shriver at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. On a little side note, this last spring, I unexpectedly had a flight delay in New York City and got to go and see St. Patrick's Cathedral, and it is just a stunning place. Hey, you guys, I am traveling over spring break and ended up actually in New York City unexpectedly, and I get to see St. Patrick's Cathedral. I will include a little video I took from the inside and some from the outside here so that you guys can see it, but I was struck by that architecture and just the absolute upwardness of the building. It boggles the mind the way that people who were our forebears understood architecture and the power that it could have on your soul, just the gasp that happens when you see it. So what a place to get married. Jack, possibly moved by that occasion, soon proposed to Jackie by telegram. Doesn't that sound romantic? She was in London photographing the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Very cool. He knew in his gut that Jackie, a free spirit, could not be tamed to behave like other Kennedy wives and women. That's the assessment of his longtime friend, George Smathers. And when Jackie accepted, he gave her an emerald and diamond ring. They did not announce their engagement immediately because Jack and his father didn't want to overshadow a big story that was coming up in the Saturday Evening Post. The title of it was The Senate's Gay Young Bachelor. Of course, that use of gay does not imply homosexual, but the gayness of happiness, being a young bachelor, could imply that. But regardless, that was the image that was being cultivated at this time, and they wanted that feature to go through before he was announced to be engaged. On June 25th, the engagement was officially announced at a party given by Janet and Hugh Auchincloss at Hammersmith Farm. Janet did not consider him good enough for her daughter. On her wedding day, Jackie wore a floor-length veil of rose point lace that had been worn by her grandmother, her mother, and Lee. I think that would be really special. We didn't have anything like this from our family. Now I have my great-grandmother's gold ring and I have my grandmother's pearls, and those things are very precious to me. When I wear them, it's very meaningful. But to have a wedding veil like this would just be really a lovely connection point with the women in your family. I love traditions like that. It was a clear and windy day on September 12th, 1953, and unfortunately, Black Jack was fresh from drying out in a French clinic, and he fell off the wagon in a big way and had to be confined to his hotel room during the service. So Jackie's stepfather, Hughie, the holder of the largest collection of pornography in the world, stepped in and walked her down the aisle. The newlyweds spent their wedding night in New York at the Waldorf Astoria and left the next day for a honeymoon in Acapulco. One of the first moves was to write her father a long letter, forgiving him for the wedding no-show. I just was struck by the grace of this, and it also strikes me in this way. I had a friend who I thought about, we were possibly going to move near them. Her one response in our first conversation about it was just, you know what, we would love to have you close, but if you move close, we're going to have to keep short accounts. Meaning, if we do something to irritate one another, let's deal with it promptly. And to me, this feels like that. It's an attempt to just keep a short account, deal with this offense, and let it go and move forward in grace. It's such a beautiful, big charactered thing to do, to forgive from the outset, to offer grace for something that is so monumental. And you know what? Even as I was reading it this time, I didn't notice this when I read through it the first time, but as I read through, it strikes me in sharp contrast to the public display that we had of Meghan Markle's father being unable to walk her down the aisle and her future father-in-law stepping in to walk her down the aisle. But then the letter that we read from her that was just self-pitying and angry and released to the press, and planned to be released to the press, that when it was being written, she discussed it with his advisors and knew it would probably be released to the press. So they wrote it with that in mind. All that to say, it just stands in sharp contrast that this woman who had been, abandoned by this father, potentially, she could have taken that line, but she still wanted him to walk her down the aisle. And yet, even after a stint in rehab, the minute he gets out, he's so vulnerable to alcohol that he falls off the wagon and can't do this big moment in her life. And she offers grace. I just think it's a really beautiful insight into Jackie's character and her willingness to make peace. I think it's really a big-hearted thing to do. On April 24th, 1954, Patricia Kennedy married movie star Peter Lawford in a 10-minute ceremony at St. Thomas More Church in New York. Joe had no objections to his fourth daughter marrying a bisexual British-born actor. Rose was distressed because Lawford was Anglican, but relented when he agreed that the children would be raised Catholic. In many ways, Lawford was a Kennedy man. He began sexual relations at age 10. Now, there again, we have to pause our reading because I think this glazes over. I mean, this book was written, I believe, in 1996, yes. And there's a way of talking about this that we just don't do anymore because it's not the appropriate way to talk about it. A 10-year-old cannot begin sexual relations. That's not something that they inherently do unless there has been an introduction from some other source, and that is exactly what we find with Peter Lawford. We may end up moving to that biography after this one if you guys are continue to show interest, and I'm reading it privately right now. But to say he began his sexual relations at age 10 is really a wrong telling of the details. He was used and abused by adults in his life that he ought to have been able to trust. He was put in vulnerable positions by people that he should have been able to trust. And so his sexual proclivities from there forward, his sexual behaviors from there forward, are a response to actions that were against him and on his person that were criminal. And so I don't want to glaze over that. Those things are wrong. If one of these things happened to me or to you, it's inherently wrong. It is never the child's fault. They never ask for it. There's never a time when they were doing this and so this was done to them. No, adults control themselves around children. They don't have sexual actions toward children. That's the right way for things to be. And so for this man to have had a history that began at age 10, even without knowing what I know from the biography, indicates wrong actions by people who ought to have been guarding him. So he frequented prostitutes, that is true, and he had loathed his eccentric, self-centered mother from childhood. So those things are true, but beginning sexual relations at age 10 is not something that we can just glaze over and deal with in this manner. Almost immediately, Peter Lawford proved his usefulness as a member of Kennedy, Inc. He introduced Jack to Marilyn Monroe. We'll get more about that in just a moment. She's kind of teasing us with something we will get into later with Marilyn, but right now we jump back to Jack. During spring and early summer, Jack suffered from increasing trouble with his back. He was forced to use crutches and was in excruciating pain. That's even with the cortisone, remember. When Congress adjourned that August, he headed straight for the Cape to confer with a team of specialists. He had been managing to live with Addison's disease for years on this program of cortisone. It was implanted every 3 months and supplemented by oral doses daily. They recommended a complicated and extremely risky operation, which sent off alarm bells for Joe, his dad. After his experience with Rosemary's disastrous brain surgery, Joe was nervous about any risky operation involving the spine and back, but Jack couldn't live with the pain. He was admitted to the New York Hospital for special surgery on October 10th. As usual, the Kennedy family floated a false cover story through the New York Times that he was undergoing a spinal operation to clear up a wartime injury. He wasn't operated on until October 21st, and after several rocky days, he was given the last rites of the church. This would be number 2 for those of us keeping track. I had heard through just the readings that I had done about the JFK assassination that he had been administered by these Catholic last rites twice, but I didn't understand what that was. Well, now I'm seeing where those things happened. Once we read about in the last episode, and then now we're seeing this one. If you're interested in what the last rites actually include, we read that in our read through of The Death of a President by William Manchester. He went into what that looks like and what the actual readings are and just the physical process. So for those of you who aren't Catholic, if you're interested, you can go back to that Kennedy playlist that I have on my channel and look for the Death of a President series. And I believe that would be towards the end of this series. It would be while he was in the hospital. So you could look at that. By late December, still weak, he was removed to his father's house in Palm Beach. The following February, he returned for a second operation in New York and then back to Palm Beach for a long convalescence. So, that's interesting. That is nearly a year out of commission for these surgeries, and the public was definitely not aware of the extent of these. The devoted Lem Billings took a leave of absence from his marketing business to spend a month with Jack in Palm Beach. Throughout this ordeal, Jack put his time to good use by working on a book. Theodore Sorensen and several university professors like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. collaborated to help him produce Profiles in Courage, the book he dedicated to Jackie. This book related the stories of 8 political leaders, from John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts to Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, whose political courage led them to defy their constituents and their colleagues in order to serve the national good. In March 1957, Profiles in Courage won the Pulitzer Prize. As far as their marriage goes, the first few years were difficult. There were Jack's 2 spinal operations and then Jackie's 1955 miscarriage. When his health permitted, Jack was totally focused on his next step, the quest for the presidency. This required a great deal of self-absorption. Jack visited fashion photographer Howell Conant at his studio on Manhattan's West 35th Street. Jack spent an entire day with Conant, posing and then studying the contact sheets, trying to decide on his best angle. Together, they settled on a pensive look into space that conveniently hid the fact that his eyes were a bit too close together. Yes, I've noticed this in some of the photos, that as you look at him, there are times when the angle makes his eyes look odd. So that's interesting that they mentioned this, because I've noticed that, and almost to me it looks like, well, that can't be an accurate picture because he looks a little weird. But maybe there was an angle where his eyes, I guess, looked naturally a little weird. Marriage had not dampened Jack's lust for other women, and he even had relationships with some of Jackie's friends. In July 1955, Jackie walked out and went to visit her sister. Lee was equally unhappy in her own marriage, so the two sisters go to Paris. Peter Ward recalls sailing with the sisters in the south of France that summer. He said, Jackie left Jack Kennedy at that time. They were split. Jack was having trouble with his back, and Jackie had a rather bad conscience about that, but that was all. She said, I'm never going back, in my presence, several times. She wasn't the least upset and seemed to be having a very good time. As for Jackie, however, she soon discovered that she was not cut out to be a political wife. Evelyn Lincoln recalled, Jackie didn't like people in the political world, and she never wanted to go campaigning with Jack, ever. So he lived a life of his own. He was gone quite a bit, and she traveled a lot. She would go to Europe and Hyannisport or Palm Beach, but in their way, they loved each other. Jackie, who had already experienced one miscarriage, could no longer bear to be in the big house that she and Jack had purchased in Virginia. That would be difficult, puttering around in a house that was so big because you expected to fill it with children, and instead it's just empty and you're away from people. So they sold the house to Bobby and Ethel and moved back to Georgetown. According to one friend of the couple's, Jack and Jackie separated 3 years after their marriage. So Joe, concerned about his son's political future, remember the whole reason he has to have a wife is because he's going to be a president. He meets with Black Jack Bouvier, and together the two forged a reconciliation between their children. The agreement was that Jackie would go back to Jack, but he wouldn't fling the affairs in her face, says the friend. Now, my understanding is that also there was a great monetary amount involved that she was given as her own personal money at this time. I think also possibly there was a discussion of future monetary payments if she ever got another STD that led to miscarriages, because that was the suspicion that Jack's STDs had transmitted to her and caused her to lose the baby. So I think there was more to this arrangement that involved money than is being said here, which is a little surprising because I think Nellie Bly is bringing us a lot of really interesting details. So it's interesting that that's not listed here. In May of 1956, Jean Kennedy, the sister between Bobby and Ted, she's the last Kennedy sister, she gets married to Stephen Smith at St. Patrick's in New York. Stephen Smith would end up being sort of a bagman for the Kennedy family. Later, when we get to the Chappaquiddick story, he is a prime player in that story. He is one of the very first people that Ted Kennedy calls with that information. So just like Peter Lawford is a brother-in-law who becomes useful to the Kennedy family, Stephen Smith appears to be that as well, sort of a financial handler and keeper of secrets, very similar to Peter Lawford in his own way. And he just does it in future generations, whereas Peter Lawford was more of Jack and Bobby's man. That summer at the Democrat convention in Chicago, Jack was asked to make the nominating speech for presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson. He did so well, he was encouraged to campaign for the vice presidential nomination, but he didn't win that nomination. Nevertheless, that exposure established his image as a youthful, determined fighter. And Bobby's experience on the convention floor, desperately scouring for votes, would be invaluable 4 years later. In August 1956, after he had lost this hard-fought struggle, Jackie gave birth to a stillborn daughter. But by that time, Jack was off sailing with Teddy and friend George Smathers on the Mediterranean. So the attempt for the vice presidency happened, and also Jackie is having her own stillbirth experience, at which point they sell the house. And the agreement is Jackie will go back, but he's not going to throw his affairs in her face. Black Jack died in August 1957 at the age of 66. Jack went in person to the office of the managing editor of the New York Times, accompanied by Jackie's uncle and carrying the obituary that Jackie had written. The funeral for Black Jack was held on August 6th in St. Patrick's. By that time, Lee Bouvier Canfield was seeing Stanislaus Radziwill, a Polish prince known as Stas. Cut off from his country and fortune, Stas had settled in London, recouped a modest fortune, acquired British citizenship, and maintained the honorific title of prince. So I believe she becomes a princess. Is that right? I don't remember her official title. I think she becomes Princess Radziwill. By 1958, Lee and the prince had decided to leave their mutual spouses. They married quietly on March 19, 1959, in a civil ceremony. Even before the marriage, Lee and Stas sought to have her marriage to Michael Canfield annulled. This was done for Stas, who sought to please his devout father. And in 1961, the Supreme Tribunal of the Holy Office in Rome refused to give the annulment, but by that time, even though there was no possibility of appeal, her brother-in-law is the President of the United States in 1961, and ultimately, very quietly, an annulment was obtained. She married Radziwill again, this time in a Catholic ceremony in 1963. Ironically, by that time, their marriage had begun to fade. They would grow apart and finally divorce in September 1974. So that's the Radziwill story. Jack and Jackie's first child was born on November 27, 1957. Caroline was delivered by cesarean section. She was christened not in the senator's home state of Massachusetts, nor in Washington, D.C., but in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. That same year, Jack was the subject of a Time cover story. After working on Jack's 1952 Senate campaign, Bobby had to decide on the next step for his own career. He worked briefly for the Hoover Commission. Then he learned that the Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations under Senator Joseph McCarthy wanted an assistant counsel. The idea of uncovering conspiracies and corruption continued to appeal to Bobby, and he was there on and off until 1959. It was Bobby's pursuit of Teamster leader Jimmy Hoffa that would establish him as a national figure in his own right. It's interesting. It's a brother carving out his own place alongside a very celebrated brother, but doing what's really in his own soul. And I think it's really admirable. I continue to be amazed at Bobby's fire. For most of 1956, except for his efforts to help Jack gain the vice presidential nomination, Bobby was absorbed in preparations for the Hoffa investigation. Psychohistorian Nancy Gager Clinch, who we've heard from before in this book, she believes that Hoffa held an undeniable fascination for Bobby, partly because the two men closely resembled each other. Neither was a big man physically. Both were driven, as demanding of others as they were of themselves. Privately, they lived lives of intense self-discipline. Neither smoked. Separately, this is interesting, journalists had compared each man to a coiled steel spring. That's an interesting comparison. Stiff, wound tight, and powerful. Major features on Jack and Jackie and the rest of the family soon appeared in Life, Red Book, the Ladies' Home Journal, Look, the Washington Post, and the Reader's Digest. Kennedy was a prominent figure in the bookstores. In 1958, there was an authorized biography by James McGregor Burns. Joe could rightfully boast that Jack is the greatest attraction in the country today. In the spring of 1958, Jackie and Jack were invited to a cocktail party for Sir Winston Churchill on the Christina, which was the yacht of Aristotle Onassis, docked at Scorpio. Ari was not impressed with Jack, but the 58-year-old tycoon was quite taken with the 29-year-old Jackie. "There's something provocative about that lady," he later told a friend. "She's got a carnal soul." Their paths would not cross again until 1963, 5 years later. Not every fascinating story about the young senator made it into the popular media. Oh my goodness, you guys, you are not going to believe this story. It's crazy on every level. Here we go. Some stories got no farther than the secret files of J. Edgar Hoover. There was, for instance, the story of the Georgetown couple that became obsessed with Jack's philandering. One night in 1958, Leonard and Florence Cater were disturbed by the sound of pebbles being thrown at an upstairs window. The window belonged to 20-year-old Pamela Turner, a receptionist in Jack's Senate office. Soon, he became a regular nocturnal visitor. Deeply offended, about this girl who was renting a room from them, and deeply Catholic, the Caters rigged up a tape recorder to pick up the sounds of the couple's lovemaking. Can you even believe it? They are just so offended by it, they can't help but record it. And they even photographed Jack sneaking out in the middle of the night. According to journalist Anthony Summers, they spied on the couple for months, even after Turner had moved out of their house. We get a little switch to Rosemary before we go back to this, because dealing with the media at this new level that Jack was at was a tricky game. It required creating an impression of openness and candor while maintaining the secrecy around matters that they decided, like Jack's poor health and the Rosemary problem. She was like the mad woman locked away in the attic that nobody talked about. And at this time, we should note that this sort of family connection with someone with mental instability, which would have been how it would have been seen, could have then transmitted in people's minds that, are these boys also subject to mental instability? Could they also have some sort of disability that we don't know about that's going to affect the nation? So, it could have brought that implication. And that is what Joe, I think, was trying to avoid by keeping the secret so locked down. Now, also just the absolute tragedy of the fact that her mental capacity at this point is what it is because of his misjudgment. Joe's misjudgment. But I do think that the implication it could have brought on Jack and Bobby was part of the reason why it was hidden away. As late as 1958, the family was maintaining the fiction that Rosemary had become a quasi-nun, content to renounce the glamorous world of her siblings to teach less fortunate children. In the Saturday Evening Post story on Jack, Rosemary was described as a school teacher in Wisconsin. Completely not true. I mean, she had sort of been an assistant to the nun teachers in the English countryside, but she had not done that for more than 10 years at this point. The way she was talked about in another book called The Kennedy Family was this: it was inevitable that she should study at Marymount Convent and devote her life to the sick and afflicted, and particularly to backward and handicapped children. She is the least publicized of all the Kennedys. She prefers it that way, and her wishes are respected. So it's interesting. Journalists are carrying water for the Kennedys. We'll see this again and as we go forward, that the Kennedys maintain tight relationships with journalists and can pepper the stories however they like. That summer, Robert's merciless grilling of Jimmy Hoffa before a national television audience earned him the reputation of an implacable prosecutor. So he is gaining in support and notoriety in his own right, which would feel good, I think, to be a brother in this big family and not go the way of what we'll see Teddy does, of just riding the coattails of glory, but actually carving out his own path of honor. In the spring of 1959, now we get back to those landlords. With the presidential election campaign approaching, the Caters were still obsessed with Jack's reckless behavior. They mailed details of the adulterer's conduct to newspapers, included audio tapes and photographs of Jack emerging from Pamela Turner's apartment at 1 a.m. on July 11th, 1958. Now, you guys, I want you to know there was no citation in the back for this, so I started to think like, what? Is this really true? Well, this was not just the photo they took, it includes a letter they wrote, so definitely this really happened, you guys. This was on an auction site that I happened to find, but really crazy stuff. And this couple took it upon themselves to deal with this issue. Only the Washington Star, however, runs a small item on the couple. One company, Stern Publications, sent the Caters' letter to J. Edgar Hoover, and he quietly obtained a copy of the sex tapes and offered them to Lyndon Johnson. The Caters now were still unsatisfied. They take their campaign to the streets, and they begin showing up at Jack's political rallies with hand-fashioned signs denouncing him as an adulterer. Mrs. Cater took to picketing the White House with a sign that says, "Do you want an adulterer in the White House?" None of this ever made it into the popular press. I mean, That is some dedication right there. That's interesting. I mean, they just kept at it. The Caters were apparently unaware that their tapes and photographs were just a small part of the rapidly expanding file that J. Edgar Hoover was keeping on JFK. On September 11th, 1959, days after Ethel gave birth to their fifth child, Mary Carey, who would be known as Carrie, and one day after the Senate Rackets Committee concluded its 3-year inquiry, Bobby resigned as chief counsel. He took time out to write his own bestseller called The Enemy Within. Then he was free to focus on Jack's next step, becoming president of the United States. Jack and Bobby appeared on television's Meet the Press and Face the Nation, and they were on covers of national magazines. So everything starts moving toward the presidency. Chapter 8, Jack's presidential campaign. This is a quote from Jackie in 1960. She said, "I think it's so unfair of people to be against Jack because he's a Catholic. He's such a poor Catholic. Now, if it were Bobby, I could understand it." That's a funny quote, I think, that it is the thing that people really brought criticism about Jack about. And we've talked about this in other circumstances, but part of the concern was if people were unfamiliar personally with Catholics, there was the perception by Protestants, do they owe more allegiance to Rome and to the Pope than they do to us and to our people? Like he's described as Irish American. Is he more for Ireland? Is he an Irish Catholic and he's got more devotion there? Like, who is this man? Now, in modern context, we say, well, that doesn't matter. But this was the first time the American people had faced that question. They had always had Protestant presidents. And so this was the first time that they were grappling with this question. I just think it's funny that she says, well, he's such a poor Catholic. If they had been with Bobby, then they would have known, but he's not even a good Catholic. Jack Kennedy's campaign was based on a new frontier, and his favorite campaign slogan became, "It's time to get this country moving again." And move he did. But few realized that he was fueled by potent chemicals. Sometime on the eve of the 1960s, John F. Kennedy discovered speed. Since his childhood, he had managed to function in spite of his terrible health. Cortisone had been a godsend, but he was about to get hooked on something even more powerful. The legendary Max Jacobson, a Manhattan doctor who had fled Germany in 1936, set up practice in New York, and he became physician to the stars. Jacobson's fame as, quote, Dr. Feelgood, that was his nickname, was based on his miracle tissue regenerator, which was a compound shot that was a secret combination of vitamins, painkillers, human placenta, and amphetamines. John and Jackie Kennedy began taking his shots during JFK's presidential campaign in 1960, and he would become indispensable to Jack's future. On January 2nd, 1960, in the caucus room of the Senate, Jack declared he was a candidate for the presidency. The quest for the nomination would be a struggle. Likely contenders for the Democratic nomination included Adlai Stevenson and Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson. Bobby, 34, was managing Jack's campaign, and for the first time, Teddy took on a responsible role in a Kennedy campaign. 15 years younger than Jack, he was in every sense part of another generation. He had always been the chubby little brother, barely noticed and never taken seriously. The other thing that made a real difference in Jack's campaign is this. One of the first most important contributions that Joe Kennedy made to his son's campaign was to form the Ken Air Corp. Purchase for it a $385,000 Corvair propeller airplane, and then lease it to the candidate at $1.75 a mile. The plane, which Jack Kennedy named the Caroline, became a tremendous advantage. While Hubert Humphrey either wasted time waiting around airports for commercial flights or lumbered about in his campaign bus, Jack Kennedy toured here and there in the Caroline, covering more territory in less time and at less expense. We are going to leave it there. Next time, we're going to get into the details of the campaign, particularly the various women and affairs that he kept up while he was campaigning for the presidency. It's crazy. But when you put it alongside cortisone and speed and other bodily sensations that he's being fed in order to just stay alive, I think it makes some of his decision making more obvious for what it is. And like I said before, none of that is to justify his choices, but I do think we can all grow in our understanding of why he made the decisions that he did. And he had watched his own father philander and deal with stress by having lots of women and not feeling any guilt about it. So it's interesting that that's the way that he goes also, and that he just pulls reporters along for the ride. But before that episode, we are going to get into this magazine here. It is the July 4th, 1960 special issue of Life that goes into U.S. politics. So come back for that. I'm looking forward to getting into this. I haven't even opened this one, so I'm excited to get into this with you. We will look at the election of 1960 and get just an eye toward what it was like at that time. I'm reminded of the one we did about 1938, so this one would be fast forward 22 years, and let's see what America's like at this point in history together. So come back for those. That's the next 2 episodes. It'll be the Kennedy election and the U.S. election through the lens of Life magazine. So come back for those. Let me know in the comments what was exciting to you from this episode, what was insightful or new. Could you even believe the landlord couple that recorded them and then was like a predator, like mailing out information and seeking to discredit him in public just over and over, so committed. I mean, it's impressive that they were that committed. It's also psycho stalkerish, don't you think? Anyway, let me know in the comments. We'll see you there. Have a great day. Bye.